Dames and big faces, cases in court. Fam showing love and support. You and your baby's mom thought that love was a sport. As men, we were taught to hold it.
Welcome to Where is Black ECU, a panel discussion on the impact of recruiting Black faculty on the university experience. Black ECU started in the summer of 2020 as a small group of alumni concerned about the lack of response by the university to address pervasive institutional inequities. We have since grown into a larger group from all over the United States, with a vast array of careers from the federal government, healthcare, tech industries, academia, and more. Over the last year, we have witnessed intentional actions to directly address inequitable practices throughout our country and in our workplaces, legislation, and in our communities. We would like for these intentional actions to be transparent and measurable at the university we love to call home, East Carolina. We don't want to be left behind in this change. It is our hope that our voices will collectively work together with the university so that we can become change agents. Our goal is not to hold the university accountable in identifying and communicating strategic and intentional approaches that will aid in the recruitment, retention, and success of both Black faculty and staff and students, but we also desire for that process to be transparent. We welcome the moderator of tonight's panel discussion, Professor Crystal Dixon. Professor Dixon is an assistant professor in the public health and education at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She serves as the chair for the School of Health and Human Services for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as being appointed to serve as on the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusive Excellence. And now we will start the discussion.
Hi there. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I will be introducing our esteemed panelists today. We first have Dr. Alicia Brown-Becton. She's an associate professor in the Master of Science in Clinical Rehabilitation and Mental Health Counseling program at California State University in Fresno. We also have with us Dr. Terrence Ruth, who is a former executive director of the NAACP of North Carolina and administrator for Wake County Schools. Currently, he is the president of the Justice Love Foundation. And lastly, we have educator Tamika Walker Kelly. She is the president of the North Carolina Association of Educators, and she's which is the state's largest professional organization for public schools employees. Welcome, panelists. It's such an honor to be here to learn from you today. And I'm going to go on and talk to you all about a little bit of a background, what we're doing today together. So the panel was created to bring awareness to the stagnating disparity of the recruitment, retention, and support for academic faculty that identify as Black African American. So a few objectives for today: we will share personal professional experiences as Black faculty, staff, and leaders and students, while highlighting key lessons learned in guiding students and others to success. We'll also highlight strategic ways to use the common experiences of Black faculty, staff, leader groups to work with student groups and navigate the challenges in attending a PWI or predominantly white institution. And lastly, we're going to identify strategic approaches that can aid in both Black faculty, student, staff groups, recruitment, retention, and success. So for our conversation today, when we talk, we probably will get relatively long-winded, but for the sake of time, for each question, there will be two panelists who will be given 3 minutes to comment. And then after that, you'll have 1.5 minutes per panelist for follow-up. So again, 3 minutes to initially comment, and then for a follow-up in 1.5 minutes. So we're asking you, the audience, to participate in the discussion as well by answering poll questions that will appear on your screen throughout the program, and submit questions to the panelists that will be answered during the Q&A at the very end. All right. So again, thank you for your invitation of having me here today. It is an absolute honor, and I'm excited to get started with our first question. So our first question is, how does, and this is actually directed to Dr. Alicia Becton and Tamika Walker Kelly. So how does identity influence the values and practice of being a Black student or faculty at a PWI?
Ooh, oh my goodness. Well, thank you again for that wonderful introduction. For this question to appear as simple as it does, it can be quite challenging to unpack when we talk about identity. First, identity manifests in the way we interact with others, the way we lead, we supervise, and the way we make decisions. So, most importantly, when I was a student, identity manifested in the way that I viewed the college experience and the way I observed myself at a PWI. So as a student, I was lost academically. I didn't have a mentor to assist or take me under their wing to show me how to navigate this predominantly white space as a Black student who graduated from an all Black high school in Greensboro, North Carolina, Dudley. Right. So my parents couldn't help me navigate academia. They didn't know about resources such as grants and fellowships and scholarships. I didn't see Black faculty. So that sense of belonging and that welcoming spirit was missing for me. So I started to think about my identity on ECU's campus as a student and realized I needed to connect to Black culture quickly. And so as I think about it, if I had a Black faculty member, I think that would have been easier. I would have sought that mentorship, but I didn't. So as my professional identities began to shift from a student to a doctoral student to a faculty to now a tenured and promoted professor, you know, life was good, it was getting better, but my salient identities still remain the same. I'm still a Black woman in academia. So now I'm occupying these spaces that white people historically have filled. So as I continue to transition into teaching, I was hesitant to speak up. Um, I I was only called upon sometimes for diversity and equity related topics. We can only be the directors of certain entities on campus. And so I started shying away from the idea of fighting or complaining because the odds were against me because of these identities. And I wasn't comfortable with the implications of a power struggle or even the insinuation of being an angry Black woman or too emotional or confrontational, especially when discourse began to arise. So these identities and these intersections of all of those identities made me question my place at ECU as a student, my place in Greenville, North Carolina post graduation, and then the larger society at whole, especially in higher education. And so these incidents that we're going to mention tonight that we'll continue to talk about, they aren't new. There has been decades of research on the challenges facing Black faculty, including those that make them leave academia altogether. So among those roadblocks, I think about a hostile climate and unwelcoming colleagues, students who challenge our authority in the classroom and question our expertise on teaching evaluations, lower levels of scholarly productivity, but we're giving more intense service loads. And so we have that cultural tax that comes with that too, when you're the only Black faculty member. And then also when we have difficulty publishing the work that we want to publish because it's perceived as unconventional, right? So these areas intersected with our identities greatly influence the values and the practices of being a Black student and even a Black faculty member. I don't know about my colleagues, but I know when I step into a room, I feel overly cautious. Let me make sure I dotted every I crossed every T. I need to be assertive when I'm serving on committees, but I don't want to appear as the angry Black woman, right? Feeling less than, feeling doubtful of our skills. So again, going back to those identities, when I separate, let's just say those salient identities, I think about the professional identities as a Black woman, professor, scholar, researcher, educator, advisor, and a therapist. My mere embodiment often defies what students, faculty, staff believe professors should look like. So typically, given the scarcity of Black faculty in academia, these students, the faculty, the staff, administrators, they're just not accustomed to seeing us as sources of knowledge, let alone as people who generate or produce substance, nor are we in the positions of power. So we're often doubting our own academic or leadership capabilities. And so as I was thinking about this question and really trying to unpack it, I came up with this idea that college is not only an institution where we can go to gain academic knowledge, but most importantly, college is an experience designed to help students gain a sense of self, a sense of comfort for whom they are, right? A sense of pride for where they come from, a sense of responsibility to the world around them, and a sense of direction for where they will go and whom they will ultimately become. And so when I graduated from ECU and I decided to go to A&T for my master's degree, I arrived on campus and within the first week, finally began to understand the value of my identity as a Black woman in higher education, in this world for that matter. And so when I think of the importance of Black faculty, of Black leaders and faculty members from A&T that impacted my life beyond the classroom, I think of that quote when we say, tell me and I will forget, teach me and I may remember, show me and I will learn,
Yeah.
right? And so again, having Black faculty, deans, chancellors was unimaginable beyond the sense of belonging and the welcoming spirit. Overall, it gave me hope.
Wow. Dr.
Yeah.
Beckton, thank you for that great kickoff for that first question. I would love to give Tamika an opportunity to follow up, or at least to respond, and then we'll hear from Dr. Ruth after that as a follow-up.
Yeah, sure. So, of course, thank you so much for introducing all of us, Crystal, and a pleasure to be on this panel this evening. Yeah, so unpacking the question of identity, right? Dr. Beckton said is very, it is something worth discussion and worth digging into. And so I will just reiterate a couple of things and then add a few other pieces. So, usually when we talk about the college experience for all students, it is definitely a time of discovery, definitely a time of introspection, even for our students. But that period is particularly more nuanced and more marked for students of color, particularly Black students as they enter predominantly white institutions. And as educators of color, particularly Black educators who are working in those environments. And so many of the things that we strive for all students, particularly for our students of color and Black students, as educators, right? We want to facilitate and foster a community, a climate that is welcoming, where people belong, where they feel like they matter. And particular tenets of Black culture, right? Focus around collectivism and building that sense of community, because that is part of how we continue to thrive in very difficult environments, is that sense of collectivity. And that often runs counter to the very institutions that we integrate ourselves into. And so it is very hard sometimes to craft an identity that doesn't anchor itself to a deficit model or a less than sort of stance. And so it is very important then for predominantly white institutions who want to continue to have inclusive and diverse environments to really work to foster places that are going to be welcoming to Black students.
Thank you, Tamika. That was a great add there. And I think you all make fantastic points about, for one, the point how Dr. Beckton mentioned student evaluations that are not always for Black faculty, which hope we can unpack a little bit more later. And I love your point as well, Tamika, about the importance of fostering that inclusive feeling when you're actually on campus is so important. So I'd love Dr. Ruth to follow up perhaps with some of his thoughts as well.
Again, thank you for the opportunity. And as it relates to our identity as we see it through race, diversity, or equity, while me personally, I have a long-standing commitment for reducing inequalities in African-American families and in poor communities, regardless of the environment. I realize that as educators in higher education spaces, traditionally, we're not necessarily wearing a community organizer hat or an identity in the classroom. However, it's critical that we must ensure that students in our classroom feel and experience equity in their learning process and in the right cultural context. And in order to improve the college experience for all students, especially if we're trying to emphasize identity, those who have been historically marginalized or minoritized must have the support they need to thrive, especially in predominantly white institutions. Simply admitting more students of color does not necessarily, in my experience, translate into opportunity or success without the necessary and appropriate resources really being made available. So really, so that student can have a diverse learning environment because they have diverse learning needs, and social and cultural integration preferences can feel valued and appreciated for what they bring to both the college experience and the classroom.
Wow, that's powerful, Dr. Ruth, because you made a really valid point about inclusion and the importance of being able to thrive in who we are as Black students and Black people, because we require a different type of experience, a different type of resources and type of learning that often is squelched out because of the way academia is really geared towards whiteness. It's geared towards patriarchy. It's geared towards, the status quo of what is deemed as pedagogical practices and what you should experience. So you raise an excellent point on that. So thank you all for launching us. I'm going to go on to our next question because there's so many great questions here. But if you want to add anything else, Dr. Ruth or Tamika or Dr. Becton, you have a few minutes, about 3 minutes to do that if you'd like. If not, okay. All right, we'll move forward. Excellent. We're ahead of schedule, which is great. So next question, I have a little bit more time on this question. So how does Black faculty presence impact campus structure and policies at a PWI? So I know Dr. Becton started off with that earlier, but I'm gonna start off with Dr. Ruth if you can, and that's actually geared towards Dr. Ruth and Dr. Becton, and we're gonna follow up with Tamika's response as well.
One, this is a very complex question. I think you can teach a course on this question, but colleges and universities tend to focus on the underrepresented groups of students that are integrating into PWI, but they do very little, in my experience, to prepare the dominant group of students for the integration of students of color. And so, the students, in particular African-American students, with their marginalized experiences, arrive on campus with the unconscious homework of identifying how to adjust to dominant student groups. And a more equitable approach, in my opinion, to diversity and inclusion on college campuses would be to hold listening and learning sessions for all students, but for white students and faculty and staff. In particular, you want them to learn and to create less ethnocentric campus culture and understand how the dominant cultural values, beliefs, in my opinion, behaviors in and outside the classroom are systemic and perpetuate a different level of learning preference. And I think it's essential that the universities create and implement new modes of diversity and inclusion on college campuses. And I only think that's possible through the presence of Black faculty. And I think it's key to birthing, producing, and sustaining innovation in this area.
Dr. Ruth, I want to ask you to unpack that a little bit. More modes. Can you tell us more? You mentioned listening sessions. I just want to hear a little bit more about maybe an example of a different mode you had in mind. And I'd love to hear Dr. Becton's response as well.
Well, one, oftentimes it's the homework of the student who holds I call it the default negative preference. So by default, they got to prove that they're worthy of being in that space. By default, they have to prove that they are intelligent. By default, they have to prove that the negative perception of their identity is actually inaccurate. And so the whole time they're learning, they also are proving these social cultural inaccuracies at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so the weight of adjustment is on the shoulders of that student and that professor. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need strategies in which the weight is shifted onto the other side. And so you can do that in several ways. One, you have listening sessions, et cetera, but also in elevating and promoting a diverse leadership group on campus. Also, you need to evaluate the social and cultural norms of the campus. Mm-hmm. What is the social and cultural norms of that campus telling students and faculty at orientation and at graduation, that entire session?
I was speaking to a fellow ECU Pirate graduate earlier, Nadi Bishop, who you may know, and she mentioned earlier that if you allow Blacks to set the tone of what deems as, if we reveal what Black people knew, whites would certainly not know what we knew, and they would be the inferior race of knowledge. So it's interesting how they've set the tone to knowing what, quote, knowledge is, and it's not necessarily up to them to do that. I want to kick it back to Dr. Becton and hear what she has to say as well. Thank you for that, Dr. Ruth.
Yes, that was right on the money. And I know a lot of the work that my university does is bringing everyone together, right, in regards to those diversity efforts. So I'm going to shift my lens so I don't repeat Dr. Ruth and really talk about this presence of Black faculty in this holistic perspective. And this may be my therapist hat coming out, but Black faculty may positively influence even something as simple as the mental health of our students, right? The academic self-efficacy, right? Our beliefs in regards to our place on this campus, the campus experiences. So when we're creating opportunities for students to access holistic supports from faculty and staff, this may really eliminate some of the stress that I personally hear from Black students that I may not teach, but just being a Black faculty on campus. And so when I think about that, I think about very specific examples of a doctoral student 3 weeks ago who needed a chair for his dissertation, and he couldn't find anyone. He happened to look at the faculty profiles of individuals who were able to chair, and he saw me. Never had him in class or anything. His dissertation is on examining the effects of infrastructures at PWIs versus HBCUs on Black student success. And he's in California. Wow. Southern California at that, right? And so when I think about that and I was overloaded, I said, you know what? I need to move another student because I have to chair his committee, right? Mm-hmm. Those are things that we are going to do as Black faculty members, because if not me, then who? Right. Mm-hmm. So having that Black faculty member humanizes the educational environment by developing meaningful relationships for the students and really embodying that ethic of care. So several things that we bring to the table: increase of open-minded diversity and differences. I joke all the time, I don't have to teach multicultural counseling because multiculturalism and cultural competency is infused in everything that I do, even when I teach quantitative analysis. Mm-hmm. So as I'm thinking about that, going back to some of Dr. Ruth's points, we're resourceful, we're accessible. Also, how do we share these policies and grants with community partners, especially HBCUs? And so I'll speak more to that as we get later into the panel discussion, but I just wanted to tag on because I think Dr. Ruth hit that nail on the head in regards to, we know what we need as Black folks, but we also need to make sure our counterparts also understand where we're coming from.
Thank you, Dr. Becton. That's an excellent point. You hit the nail on the head about service, or taking that burden of mentoring and being on search committees or being on dissertation committees. And so I want to ask Tamika to tell me, you're in the public school sphere. So I'm curious to know how do you balance being that point of contact for students in your sector, and how does that affect how you operate within the sphere of doing your job? Because I would imagine it adds a bit of a burden to you probably, and feeling like you have a bit of a responsibility to support our Black students.
So our organization also has higher ed members. So we work a lot with higher ed's faculty and staff. And particularly around our student program, which our aspiring educator programs in our colleges of education. So we see it from two different lenses on the college campus. And so one of the things is we continue to look at what are the barriers to making sure that we have, Black faculty and staff on campuses, be they PWIs. And how do we continue to advocate for HBU higher staff in the whole UNC system, right? But I also want to know a couple of things as well when we talk about, Black faculty and whether or not they want to to uphold campus policies and practices? Because the first question is, do they want to? Because a lot of times in some of our environments, we always have to understand that everybody plays a role in upholding white supremacy and the practices and policies that keep us disconnected from one another. And sometimes people do benefit from the way that campuses are run and are structured. So we have to do a mindset check of our people in our community, because we say all skin folk ain't kinfolk, right? So we have to be very mindful of that. And then for our faculty who wants to improve the community in which they work in, improve community for their students, do they have the tools and resources and connections necessary to even influence that change, right? Are they engaged in their faculty and staff senate in a way that they can move a critical analysis of the policies and practices of their campuses? Do they have a way to organize each other and talk to each other? When we talked in our organization about organizing educators, if you are not willing to have a one-on-one conversation with anyone that you spend a lot of time with, how are you going to move largely? So it is important to note that we have those one-on-one conversations with our Black faculty and staff to find out, what are their drivers? What are their motivations? Where is their self-interest? And does it align with the interest of our students that they serve on the campus?
Fantastic. You guys are really getting our audience involved in the chat here with great comments here. And you bring up a good point. We have 3 minutes on this question. You bring up a good point of respectability politics and the role that moral panics may play in higher education. And people often use those respectability politics to matriculate through and maintain the power and positionality they have in these spaces, and they will forfeit opportunity for progress. As you mentioned, Tamika, that was an excellent point. And the moral panics of, wait now, don't shake it up too much. You're gonna mess it up for everybody else. That's those moral panics that we see a lot, particularly in PWI. So thank you for bringing up that point. Before we move on, I'd love to give maybe Dr. Becton an opportunity to chime in one last time before we move forward. I'd love to hear your response to that if you have one.
I don't. I think it was summed up pretty well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
No, that's great. That's a great sign. Thank you all for that. Great. So let's move on to our next question. This is going to be a really loaded question. So what is a personal challenge that you have experienced in relation to being a Black student and or faculty and or staff, such as racism, motherhood, classroom experiences, sexual harassment, workplace bullying, or any other experience in leadership? So what you're comfortable sharing, we'd love to hear a personal challenge you've experienced. And we can start, actually, I'm going to direct that to Dr. Becton and as well as Dr. Ruth. Okay,
so I'll just say all of the above. Does that work?
That's an answer.
Oh my goodness. One challenge of being a Black student, I'll start as a student, was I just did not know what services or resources were available. So basically, you don't know what you don't know. So it's difficult to ask. When we think about racism on campuses, being questioned about your position, do you have faculty ID by campus police? Are you really a faculty member? Or hearing something such as, oh, you're Dr. Becton? So those subtle microaggressions, right, that we experience. Oh, I've read your work. I'm the staff member actually on your Wayfinders grant. I was like, I know who you are, right? So being in those spaces and talking to my sister scholars, sometimes I wasn't sure, was it racism? Was it ageism? Was it sexism? And then I would go to my sister scholars like, it's an ism, but I need to figure out where it falls and what I need to do about it. So this question also makes me think of the constant thoughts of racial battle fatigue and imposter syndrome. So for instance, as campus communities work to understand and respond to the calls for action following the murder of George Floyd over the summer, PWI should also work to understand the racial battle fatigue many Black students, faculty, and staff may be experiencing. So many of us are called to serve on the Equity and Diversity Committee, help brainstorm these ideas with administrators, pilot programs with no additional pay, no other supports, and there's only a handful of Black people who are already stretched thin. So then if you're the token Black person, everything's just piled on top of you. So what we have to do is recognize that these things have been going on, and the 2016 election, in my opinion, only made the larger society and our PWI start to recognize it. But it's already been a part of our experiences of Black people on college campuses. So for me, there have been several personal challenges and concerns of this racial battle fatigue, but the psychophysiological symptoms that come with that. So I had to learn skills of survival. So when you think about this question, like you said, this is a loaded question, and we could talk about this for days. But just in comparison to the literature, as a Black student, our experiences or the lack thereof caused me to question the legitimacy of my success and the extent to which I truly belonged at a PWI. So these aspects of self-doubt are key elements of what is known as imposter syndrome, right? This tendency of high achieving individuals, Black folks, to discount or question the validity of our success. So despite these objective markers of achievements, that's what happens. So again, I have to remind myself that it's not my job necessarily to make people feel comfortable. So I do need to stand in these spaces. So if anything, I look forward to leveraging our diversity and our differences in predominantly white spaces and allowing my counterparts to dwell in the discomfort. If you're by a neighbor, look at your neighbor and say, dwell in the discomfort so we can actually begin to make some real change. And so I'll stop there because I'm sure we'll have some follow-ups to this particular question.
Thank you, Dr. Becton. Excellent points. I love how you mentioned that there's a balance between being asked to do DEI work, compensation, and your service loan. Because as you know, in higher ed, you have service scholarship and teaching and research for some. And there comes an interesting intersection of being invited to do things and how that wears on you, and how does that feed into your imposter syndrome? Oh, I feel great. Someone actually validates I have expertise. I'm going to do it. When do you stop? And so our white counterparts don't do anything for free. So we have to balance that. So I'd love to hear Dr. Root's comment in response to that.
We could stop there. I think Dr. Becton really. I'll do what she did for my style. I'll pivot so that I don't duplicate what she said. But really, if you think about it, the majority of our experience, I'll talk about me, the majority of my experience is in a PWI context. And so you're talking about elementary, you're talking about middle school, you're talking about high school, and then you talk about the university. So I see the challenges as much broader than my personal experience. I still see the intersection of race and intelligence as a source of dangerous stereotypes and social assumptions. And what I mean by that, I still see where our society assumes that race hinders someone's intellectual achievement capacity. We talk about race and education achievement as inevitable. I mean, I'll let President Kelly tell you, but I mean, we're inundated with information about the performance, lack of performance of Black and brown students versus other peers in other races from elementary school, from pre-K. So I see where our society really assumes that race hinders somehow someone's intellectual ceiling. And so when we talk about race and education achievement as inevitable, I think there's something dangerous there that starts much earlier than college. And so we witness students and potential future Black professors defeated by the narrative of race and intelligence. And I think because there's a stigma of ignorance that sits on the shoulders of Black and brown and poor people. And that bleeds into staff on campus. And there's confidence built over time, but you still are wrestling with that when you enter a room and there's a room full of PhDs, but you are the only Black PhD in the room. You start to have on a different level, you start to have that same conversation of race and intelligence. But I think that, this Black student inundated with information about intellectual deficits or gaps, it exists and it's talked about through the lens of race. So my birth hinders me from intellectual achievement. It becomes something that is a birthright if it's not challenged early. And so for me, I think that's dangerous. And I think most of our conversations sit on that very dangerous assumption, social assumption. And so this relationship between race and intelligence is well documented in a book called Barbarian Virtues. I recommend you read it, Barbarian Virtues. And I think by default, historically, Black students are burdened with this stigma of intelligence or intellectual ignorance. And so there's this burden to have to prove something that is not accurate or true. And so by default, someone with that stigma of ignorance must prove that they are intelligent or that they deserve to be on that campus. And that again, I think is a more urgent challenge than my own personal story.
Wow. Powerful, powerful, powerful points there, Dr. Ruth. I'd love to hear Tamika's comment or response and or pivot in response to that, those comments.
Sure. Yeah. So my experience at ECU as a student was very much tied up into like our first question around identity, right? So when I got to ECU, I have been in predominantly Black spaces all of my life. Went to one of the Blackest high schools in North Carolina, right? E. Smith Senior High. And then I came to East Carolina University, and it was a total, culture shock. And so, of course, we all, sort of experienced racism or sexism or, during that time at ECU. I mean, we did countless marches, arguing against some faculty, including Black faculty, right, to honor Black student voice at ECU. Protesting policies that were, racist against Black students. And so that has that experience has taught me a lot as a Black leader, particularly leading the organization I do. It is a merger of a Black and white educator organization. And in these highly racial and politicized and partisan times that we are doing this work in, a lot of the attacks to my person, to the person who I am, how I lead, because it's very different. I don't mind making people uncomfortable. I don't mind saying anything that needs to be said, but those things continue to happen, those racist attacks. And so it is important that we, acknowledge that for what it is, because it is important that we acknowledge it for what it is, but we also can't talk about racism as like an individual act as well. We have to look at the way those things happen systemically. Like, what is it about the culture at ECU that allows that to be okay, that allows that to foster there, and what is the university doing about it? And so that is increasingly important as we continue to see, like, our students. I've watched the iteration of like the Black Student Union and things like that. How our students are responding to ways to say that they are not going to continue to work in those types of, to donate, pay their money there, accept scholarships there. So what are we doing to help assist our students in combating and pushing back against those types of environments?
Tamika, thank you. And you made a comment. You said you learned a lot. In 1 minute, you think you can tell us maybe one major lesson you've learned from that experience? We'd be curious to know. Like you mentioned, you learned a lot. Maybe something that stood out to you in your response.
Yeah. So one thing I learned is that there's power in organizing, and there is power in and knowledge. I mean, like the whole point of going to college is to gain knowledge, but when it is important to know how your enemy, it's important to know how they see you.
Right.
And that knowledge is increasingly important as like we try to help our students and our faculty navigate the system. You have to learn it. You have to learn the language. You have to learn how they move, how they operate in order to use it to your advantage.
Thank you for lifting up organizing, because I know Black Student Union at ECU and in several institutions across the country have leveraged that space to organize for institutional change. And so thank you for mentioning that. So important we do that. So I'd like to move on to our next question. So we're nearing to the end here, but we have one of our last two questions is, with Black Lives Matter heavily present in the last year, where although it started before last year, but how are PWIs nurturing our Black professors and Black students to feel safe, heard, and included on campus? So how has that impacted that space? And this is going to be directed towards, I'm going to actually have you come back, Tamika, and speak on that, if you're okay with that, and have Dr. Ruth follow up with that, and we'll hear from Dr. Becton as well.
Not a problem. I think this question really leans into President Kelly's statement before. One, I have I have had the privilege to be a part of the organizing of bodies to stand against an issue. And I have also had the opportunity to observe those who are receiving that pressure. And that pressure actually changes minds, actually changes dispositions. And some people, they go, what's the purpose of organizing? What's the purpose of getting a group of people together to protest? It actually puts pressure in a moment in which you can move to action. And there is a reason behind it, there is a purpose behind it, and there is a weight behind it. And so I think the Black Lives Matter protest created a season that placed pressure on higher education institutions and forced, in my opinion, a more inclusive, outcome-driven vision around race. It's no longer just higher, but what are the outcomes that's really driving this conversation? And for me, I have witnessed a very strong and courageous youth voice activated by this previous season. And you're seeing where students they were originally remote, but the media platform that they operate on has really given them control over certain narratives that can't be stifled or regulated by an institution. Mm-hmm. And so I think the social media instrument really placed the power in students' hands and allow for them to create unprecedented pressure on institutions. And so now they're defining what safety is, and they're defining what mental and social support means around race, and they're defining what does it mean to carve a path forward. And so for me, I think this season has empowered students. It has allowed for them to become more of a driver than an observer on.
Wow, Dr. Ruth, thank you for that. It sounds like there's a shift in power in defining what systemic change truly looks like in higher ed with BLM. So thank you for that. And I love that, President Tamika. I should have been saying that. But I love to hear President Tamika's response to that question as well.
Not a problem. And it's okay, Crystal. So I remember an experience I had when I was interviewing for the Elite Pirate Award, and I was asked, how did I feel about ECU's commitment to diversity? And I said that it was one of the things where ECU has to move beyond tolerance to acceptance and inclusion. And I want to be, particularly mindful that words like inclusion, equity, and diversity have become really buzzwords and sort of trendy, right? They've been co-opted and commodified. And so we have to be really careful about how people use those words. So I think in this moment, with the racial reckoning that we saw during the summer around the protests about George Floyd, and the continuing evolving of the Black Lives Matter movement, our PWIs have to be more, they have to move past their diversity statements that they put out. And they have to be able to turn those words into action. because lots of entities, our university, lots of universities, companies, brands, they all put out statements around supporting Black students and students of color and things like that during the summer. And our question has to be, when they make these statements, who are they truly accountable to? Mm-hmm. When they talk to their trustees, when they are talking to their largest donors, when they are soliciting different voices for different activities, how does this align to the work that they are doing? What do their budget priorities look like? Are they funding systems and programs that are going to be supportive of Black students on campus? So it is our job to hold them accountable to these statements that they made during the summer. Like, we cannot lose sight of what we wanted. We cannot lose that momentum, because they say if you want an idea to die, you start a committee. And lots of places will do that. They will say, okay, we will start a committee, we'll start working on it, and then the cycle goes on. They will never address it. And so it is our job to hold them accountable to the words that they speak, because if their words and their budgets don't align to their actual actions, then all of that work is for naught. So that is our role in holding them accountable.
Thank you, President Tamika. That's powerful. At UNC Greensboro, one of the things we're looking at is promotion and tenure policy in terms of equity across race and the importance of that. And so that's getting into sustaining our faculty, not just hiring and not just, just bringing them on and leaving them, to fend for themselves. So I appreciate you mentioning the importance of that. I'd love to hear from Dr. Becton. A follow-up question in response to that is, do you think the ongoing BLM presence or Black Lives Matter presence has impacted the presence of Black professors and Black students at PWI? So has that had any direct impact on the very presence of those two groups of individuals?
I would say yes, in the sense of, I'll go back to one of my original statements that, again, this was already occurring. It's just highlighted now, right? And to the original question in regards to how are PWIs nurturing Black professors and Black students to feel safe, heard, and included, I think is what you said. There's a lot of conversations, a lot of lip service, tons of task forces and committees as we've talked to, but I'm really waiting to see the deliverables, the outcomes. What's the budget to make these things happen? And so I'm just going to speak very candidly. It sounds good. Sounds great. And I see a lot of chat in the in the chat box about this. But one thing I will say I appreciate about my campus is that they have now an Office of Black Student Success, which is OBSS, and is committed to providing supportive services that foster that transition and integration of Black students into the university and help them to thrive and achieve academic and personal success. So it goes back to some of our earlier comments about that holistic approach working with Black students. So I hear what we're saying, and I saw some of the comments, but PWIs, it's my hope that across the nation, they too are putting their money where their mouth is. And that's just kind of where I'm coming from. I know for us, many of the Black faculty on my campus are Greek. It's not that many of us, but NPHC has had a huge involvement. And I know there's conflicting thoughts about NPHC and BSU and NAACP. And recently I had to sit on a panel in regards to service and how this impacts the presence, again, of Black students and Black faculty. Because when people see us in a community, they see us serving, that is a positive impact. So I just wanted to throw that out because those were some of the thoughts that came up as Dr. Ruth and President Kelly were responding to the question. Oh, okay. And I'll stop there. The poll. just popped up.
No, you're fine. Well, actually, while you're in that vein, Dr. Becton, I'd like to
Yes.
transition and ask you another question. You mentioned the importance of recruitment and retention. So given the challenges we've been discussing tonight, it leads one to wonder, how have you survived as a Black faculty and in your particular institution? So we're wondering about that. So the question is, how would you advise administration to implement a change in retention, recruitment of Black faculty, staff, and students? You mentioned budget. That's an excellent start. What's a tangible recommendation you would recommend? And I'd love to hear from President Tamika after that as well.
Okay, so I'll go back to your original question in regards to how have I survived beyond prayer. So I'm prayers in there for sure. I made myself a promise in 2016 that I would move from this place of really surviving to thriving. And so now my mission is to thrive in academia. So mentorship has been at the forefront. And I encourage everyone, whether it's informal, whether it's formal, or peer-to-peer mentorship. So like Dr. Dixon, hey, we're both at institutions. What's going on? We're across the country, but that mentorship has been vital to my survival. As a tenured Black faculty member now, I had to remember what really shaped my development and ignited that fire in me. So I'm a Black queen, right? And so when I walk into a room, being relentlessly proactive, practicing humility, but also demanding respect. And I had to tell myself, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? And so that goes back to that racial battle fatigue. Like, okay, let me jump into this. So when you ask me some of the strategies for administrators to implement change and retention and recruitment, first, I would say equitable support for Black or cross-cultural centers, programs, and initiatives. I just shared that we have the Office of OBSS now, that paid positions for Black individuals to actually cater to this work, right? Which helps with that sense of belonging among Black students. I would also say increase the presence of Black faculty members, of course, hence increasing the opportunity for Black students to build these relationships and engage with professors and potential mentors who share a similar racial and ethnic background, among other identities. Another piece of that is hopefully, again, increasing the enrollment of Black students to reflect at the very least the percentage of Blacks, let's just say in the US population. Okay. Highlight and emphasize topics, issues, and individuals within the curriculum that are culturally relevant to Black students in all disciplines. So that's spanning from humanities all the way to STEM. Okay. And these are only a few strategies, and I'm sure President Kelly will mention others. But to put this into context, it is important to note that not all Black students, let's say who attend PWI, struggle to develop this identity or a sense of self. But in a society where education seems to be the most effective weapon against social, political, and economic oppression, we cannot afford for a single Black student to graduate from a university empowered with this academic knowledge, but unsure of how and where to use that particular knowledge. And so that is another purpose of what we're doing here today. And I'll pause there into our next follow-up question.
That's excellent. It was actually our last question. So I want to hear from President Tamika as well as we'll follow up with Dr. Ruth. But I think I want to pause for a moment and recognize Dr. Becton as being a Black tenured faculty member. I mean, that is phenomenal. What a phenomenal accomplishment. When you all read the data about what they're saying, they say publish or perish. It's to the point where you might die in the process of achieving what she's done. So I wanted to give homage to her for all that she's done. So thank you for that space.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon.
Call me Crystal, please. I'm not there yet, but I will I will let you know what I can.
We are speaking it into fruition.
There we go. President Tamika, I would love to hear your response, and I would love to end with Dr. Ruth with a follow-up question.
Sure. So I would say it is not very different from the way we talk about supporting and nurturing Black students in the K-12 setting is not very different than the way that we recruit and support Black teachers in the K-12 setting, right? You can't recruit what you're not actively seeking, and you can't retain anything you don't nurture and support. So it is critically important that institutions make investments in recruiting in spaces that we know the Black people are. Like, it's really important for us to be learning from our HBCUs, to be going to, for students, and faculty, to be going to the places, the HBCUs, to go into historically Black high schools, to be going into parts of the state where our students typically don't have access to some of these campuses and programs and things of that nature. But it is also important that once we get them there, once we recruit faculty with competitive salaries, with supportive places where they can mentor and learn from one another, it is important that once we get them there, we keep them there with funding for the supports and resources they need. For our students, Dr. Beckton mentioned earlier, right? Our kids, even our big college kids who are like semi-adults, right? They need to see themselves reflected in the things that they learn and that they engage with. We call that mirror and windows. That's Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. It is really important to have that across departments, like it was mentioned, not just in the athletic department, not just in the School of Business, not just in sports management, right? But everywhere. For example, I was in the School of Music. I had 2 Black professors the whole time I was there, just one, just 2. And one of them happened to be my vocal coach. The other person was in the jazz department. So outside of the traditional norms for our students, and then for our faculty, they need those affinity spaces to come and talk to one another that aren't bound by the respectability politics structure that we talked about earlier, that aren't bound by the rules of the campus. And they need opportunities to grow and thrive on their campuses. Right, like you can't become a tenured professor unless your college supports that and provides you the opportunity to do the research that is necessary. Our students can't thrive in so many of these places because they're on unpaid internships, right? And internships are labor, and we should pay people for their labor, right? So all of those systematic changes that are necessary are connected to funding priorities, are connected to how we develop our budgets, who oversees these programs as well, because sometimes somebody can oversee a program to its demise, or somebody can oversee a program and see it thrive. So that is also important as well. So it is not how we grow and support Black students and faculty in the higher ed community is no different than how we do our students in our K-12 institutions. If we want to see them grow and thrive to their highest potential, then we need to invest in them as well.
Wow. Thank you, President Tamika. That's a fantastic segue, because you made some very, very valid points and recommendations of how to support our students. So I want to actually ask Dr. Ruth, as we conclude with our main part of this event, we're going to then go on to our Q&A with the audience. But Dr. Ruth, in this environment, given what President Tamika just said, how would you actually encourage Black students and faculty? Because, sometimes we need to be uplifted. We need some kind of encouragement to get through. We can't always just, get coffee. We need some good encouragement. So what does that look like to you?
Thank you for the question. And one, it's difficult mentally and physically. Your mental health actually impacts your physical health, but it's difficult to have healthy, sustained mental health when you're in an environment that either directly or indirectly either eliminates the significance or value of your identity, or it puts or elevates or celebrates the very opposite of who you are. And so racial intellectual deficits I got 3 points just to close out, and I'll be quiet, I promise. But racial intellectual deficits are not inevitable and imaginary. The field of science has declared that there's no relationship between race and intelligence, but our larger society needs to follow that declaration because it actually has an impact on mental health.
Mhm.
You actually start to consume that perception. And so for me, that's a statement of strength. There is no deficit between our relationship between race and intelligence. Next thing is, I would encourage Black professors to support and invest in Black students in a meaningful way, even if they're not in your department. It's amazing how many stories I can tell you of a professor who changed the very trajectory of my life,
Mm.
and even as a professor. And so for me, I think that's significant. My last point, I actually have hope in the students who are on campus. I think activated students can really swing momentum and energy around race on campuses. We celebrate Senator Lewis, we celebrate Jesse Jackson and others, and they were students who were activated to drive change on campuses. And so we also celebrate, I think this is probably more significant, we also celebrate Ella Baker. And she championed a leadership model that is decentralized. She actually said that you can affect change, sustain change on a college campus by decentralizing, investing in those students, allowing them to drive and experience leadership. Because what was more important to her than one hero was a pipeline of heroes.
Mhm.
And I think what I'm seeing is a very decentralized, activated student body that can really move the narrative on conversation of race, both on and off campus.
Wow. Powerful. Thank you so much, Dr. Ruth, for ending on that powerful note. I'd like to lift up Anna Julia Cooper as well, who is similar to Ella Baker, as you mentioned. So thank you for that. Our audience has been chatting up something. They have been going in and dropping some very powerful points in the chat. So I want to give this space now to ask a question that has been provided to me here. And I want to ask a question here. And I'm going to give you all about 60 seconds. That's going to be hard for academics here. Okay. 60 seconds. So we try to respond. So the question is, will you describe the impact and challenges? So that's kind of hard, it's two-part, but diversity and inclusion committees can have at a PWI. So for example, some have said that it's busy work and they're only effective if there's power to leverage with administration. So perhaps let's just talk about the impact. What have you seen DEI committees actually do on campus settings? And we'll start with Dr. Becton. 60 seconds.
Well, I think I shared some of that earlier in our discussion in regards to, again, OBSS. We also have a President's Equity and Human Relations Committee that we do have a budget. And so there is a line item specifically for support of Black students. That is something that we did, I guess you would say, caucus together as Black faculty to meet with the president and provide these guidelines based on faculty from around the world and some of the thoughts that we had. So again, going back to some of the earlier points, there are ways to do this, but I would say figure out who your allies are as well, because it wasn't just Black faculty in that meeting. We also had support from other affinity groups as well as some of our white counterparts. But be strategic when you're approaching these particular situations as well, and then reach out for that mentorship.
Excellent.
And I'll pause
Thank
there.
No, excellent. Great. Let's model Dr. Becton here. President Tamika,
Yes.
how would you respond to that?
So I've seen DEI committees do really great work when they censor the most marginalized voices in their communities. So if the DEI committees don't actually have the voices that they're trying to affect, then those communities don't necessarily work, because you can't speak for other people. You have to let people advocate and speak for themselves. And so one of the other things is how I've seen really good work when they make long-term sustainable investments in the work they're trying to do by establishing structures that allow the work to continue to grow and foster. But if they're looking for a quick fix, right, then that work is not going to be sustainable, and it's going to be lost in the next cycle of things that are happening.
Thank you for that. And interesting to hear you say that perspective. We need a balance. I do see in the chat, some people believe that allyship, as well as Dr. Becton, is important as well. So I think it's important to see the full spectrum of that. Dr. Ruth, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think all the statements are right on it. I call it the fog of race. We could be transparent and we love data and we're data driven. We have big data until we talk about race. And then now we have a fog. I think there's a way in which we can actually lean on data in the DEI committees, but also that data should produce meaningful outcome that is across the organization and not housed in that committee. And what I've seen, what President Kelly said before, I've seen where these committees exist for a very long time and have very meaningful conversations, but it doesn't transform the norms of the existing structure. And it only attracts those who are interested in that conversation. And so you don't see where the power is leveraged to transform the existing larger organizational or campus norms. And so it's that transfer to a normative practice that I think you see the most meaningful work of DEI camp or committees.
Wow. Powerful. I see a comment in the chat that DEI staff should lengthen the table to sit at to include voices they represent. So that goes along with what President Kelly was saying, that, you know, you gotta have people at the table that you're trying to serve. So excellent job with that round. There's one question that came in. You all clearly have influenced some of our viewers here. I'm an ECU alumni who applied for an adjunct position at ECU. I have my EDD, and it's extremely challenging to get an interview for a full-time professor position. So the question is, can you advise this individual and or others how they can stand out and secure a position, whether it be ECU particularly or at a higher ed institution? But it sounds like this is more specific to ECU. And that can be, and we'll start with Dr. Becton, and then we'll circle back to Dr. Ruth and so on.
Can we go to Dr. Ruth? I was wondering, I was reading the comment in the chat, and if we could maybe just share out, because I think it only went to the panelists.
Oh, the chat? Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I don't know.
After this. Okay.
Yes, you can do that. Sure. No, I'm not sure if I follow, but whatever that you receive, you can certainly paste it in the chat if you like. If that's what you're saying, Dr. Becton.
Not a problem. And so what I'll say, there's several things. One, when I went to my PhD program, it was a quantitative, it leaned in more quantitative studies. It taught me everything about quantitative studies. It showed me how to write my dissertation. It even expanded my view of public affairs. What I had to learn from a Black woman professor, actually, is how to build my CV. I actually had to learn what is an interview for a professor versus what and I thought I've been on several. I thought I was ready to go, but I actually was mentored by a professor, and that professor actually took my resume, rewrote it, showed me where the errors were, showed me what's acceptable, prep for the type of questions I should look for, and it even showed me how to write a response. So I actually had to go back to the drawing, go back to my ABCs, and it was an actual professor who took me under their wing and just showed me what does it mean to, and with a level of excellence. And I'm not saying that the person who asked the question, but that's my response. I actually leaned on actually really exposed me to what does it mean to interview with excellence at a university.
Thank you for that. So very important to have that resource to help you, because that is the first thing they see when they're vetting candidates. There's an excellent question that came in again, and for the sake of anonymity, I will not mention the name, but if you'd like to reveal yourself, please feel free to mention in the chat. In Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, the author argues that there are 3 ways to impact change from the outside of organizational leadership. Exit means leaving, such as removing your money. Voice is the power to organize and articulate what you want to see. And loyalty is when you stay on in spite of your voice not being addressed. Loyalty, however, has a value limit without the money to amplify. Institutional loyalty is a misnomer. Institutions have no loyalty. So the question is, how do you use leverage points as alumni, to make impact? So all that was context to kind of build up to the question. So how do you use leverage points as alumni to make impact? Thank you for that question. And we're going to pose that. Who would like to respond to that? That's a loaded question, so I don't want to put anyone on the spot to respond to that. But who'd feel comfortable to respond to that?
I'll take a stab at it.
Thank you.
Because, you know, it talked about different ways of organizing outside of the organization. And really, I just think there are two orientations to like organizing in general, right? So you can organize with people, or you can organize with money. And usually most people don't have the money, so they organize with people. And so leveraging our position as alumni, a lot of our alumni, particularly our Black alumni, we're connected and disconnected at the same time, right? So we are connected because we have, our groups, and, we have relationships and friendships that connect us together, but we are also slightly sometimes disconnected from the institution we graduated from, because many of us view it as an encapsulated experience, right? And so it's really important for us to leverage our connections with one another to organize each other and see if we want to leave a legacy of improvement for the students that have to come behind us. How do we use our own connections, whether it be our connections to staff, our faculty inside the organization, whether it's our connections to families that we know who have connections to the university. How do we organize ourselves to organize within the university for the changes that we want to see? And how do we build up and network the current relationships with our students who are on campus, which is also critically important as well, because we don't want to be organizing for something that our students are not going to benefit from. We can't organize for stuff that our students on the campus don't want. And so it's really important for us to bring their voices into the conversation as well, because, they have to live inside the changes that we are trying to seek. And so we need to be in constant conversation with them. So that is how we leverage our people power. We know that the university just solicited lots of money during Giving Day for, alumni. And so we have to be accountable to we have to ask them to be accountable to us as donors as well. Like, where's my money going? Who benefits from my money? Like, my donation went to the Ladonia Wright Cultural Center. You know why? Because that was an instrumental part of my experience at ECU. But I'm not donating to a regular general fund because I don't know how it's going to benefit Black students on campus. So we need to be asking those questions about our donations and be willing to withhold our labor and our money from our institutions when we need when we need to force the conversations that are necessary for systemic change.
I love your continued threading of organizing, which is awesome because we don't talk about that enough, and it's often buried, and it's so good that you're resurrecting that today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Does anyone want to chime in, or I can probably fit in one or two more, probably one more question in. We'll see what our organizers are telling me, but I think we have room for one more question. But does anyone want to add on to what Professor Kelly mentioned? All right. So I'm going to ask one question here. This is a great question because a lot of us are in respective institutions or where we're working. And the question is, how do you ensure within a PWI within that PWI culture, that you don't open yourself up to subliminal, passive, aggressive retaliation? So when you're pushing for real DEI policies and challenges, how do you protect yourself from the retaliation of that? Any suggestions or recommendations of how to matriculate through that space and push for change?
I think President Kelly is best positioned to answer this, but I will try first. One, I would say affecting change will require a sacrifice. That's just period. I mean, at some point, a decision to move in a moral direction is going to require that something is given up. And you must come to the conversation with that disposition. Now, with that being said, you need to figure out what you're willing to sacrifice. And when you decide what you're willing to sacrifice, you need to understand what's the best use of your pressure to affect change. But if you're going to move forward in any sort of movement or justice work, you're going to lose friends. You may be unpopular. You may not get that promotion, but the next professor or student will get that promotion. Will get that. So I mean, it has to be. You have to see yourself in a lineage and a legacy of a larger journey whenever you enter this work. And I don't get as much dislike mail. I won't call it hate mail. Dislike mail as President Kelly, but it's real, and it's not a joke. There is a sacrifice, and I think it's a part of the hesitation for many people. And so your presence and your boldness and your courage actually lingers way beyond you. And so I'll stop there. But a sacrifice is part of the journey.
Wow, that's powerful. It's like you got to prioritize what's worth losing to make a legacy for change for those that are behind you, which is so important. Does anyone want to add in maybe for about 60 seconds, anything to that? Because I'd love to close shortly with a comment from a participant after you all are done. Any thoughts on that? Additional thoughts? Dr. Beckton, do you have some? Okay. Okay. Professor, okay.
Yeah, I'll just be really quick.
No, please.
But you cannot ensure that you won't face that kind of pushback. There's no way. Your sheer existence by itself and you walking in who you are and who you are meant to be is what we call a radical act itself, right? So you will face those passive aggressive subliminal attacks, particularly in academia, because it is not culturally okay in those circles to be outright racist or sexist or whatever, right? Like it is culturally frowned upon in those spaces, right? So there's no way to ensure that you won't. You have to decide if this is work that is meaningful to you, if it is work that you believe is necessary, then you build your team and you do the work.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Wow.
And I'll just make one quick comment.
Please, no, join in. Come on.
One thing I tell myself, just to echo everything my colleague stated, was I try to go in, okay, they're playing checkers, it's time to play chess. Mm-hmm. I have to be strategic. Approaching early tenure and promotion, motherhood, I still had a voice. That doesn't mean silence yourself, but what does that look like? Going back to that allyship. What are the policies? Making sure you are aware, what does the institutional policies say? And I know them like the back of my hand, right? Documenting everything. So for me, it's not easy, to Dr. Ruth's points. It's not easy at all. But again, if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? Because we will always face challenges no matter what. So to be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is truly the greatest accomplishment. So never lose yourself and remember who we are, Black queens and Black kings. So continue to play chess and we'll go from there. I see the comments. Thanks. Chess, not checkers.
Wow. This has been a phenomenal space. And I want to thank our panelists. And I want to end before you all log off, I have to read this comment from one of our participants. But an attendee in response to this space said, "This was comforting. As an involved, invested, and campus leader of ECU, just before I came to this webinar, I was verbally accosted, physically threatened, and followed by a stranger with bigoted tendency behavior that led him to follow me to my home. I am part of the ECU community, and since the deaths of Breonna and Taylor and George Floyd, the racial, bigoted, and biased behavior has increased both on campus and off campus. I was in the ECU police officer for over 2 hours leading to my attendance to this forum tonight. So hearing this tonight was strengthening to my spirit and some glimmer of hope for a better future. And please, they're asking, can someone from the Black ECU alumni reach out to me? Hopefully, I believe that message was what Dr. Becton was referring to earlier. Please
Yes,
do
it
reach
is.
out to that individual. And thank you for lifting that up. I didn't see that. But we are at time. So I wanted to just end tonight and say thank you for President Kelly, Dr. Becton, and Dr. Ruth for your fantastic insight, comments, and all the amazing work and legacy that you're leaving where you are. It has been my absolute pleasure to learn and co-learn with you and our members that are watching us. And I just want to say, keep pushing for systemic change. Be that voice that wasn't with you when you were in school. Be courageous. Build allyship across racial lines, and don't be afraid to say no when the time is right, but leave a legacy in this work. So at that, I'm going to close and thank you all for attending tonight. Have a blessed evening or good night.